Can everybody move up a little, please?
Try to fill up the seats as best as you can, like in the front.
Yeah, you have two.
Alright, good evening everyone. Assalamu alaikum. For those who may not know what I just said, it's totally fine. Assalamu alaikum, it's basically an Islamic greeting, which means may the peace and blessings of Allah or God be upon you all. So feel free to say it. First off, I want to welcome everyone to our first event of Islam Awareness Week. So we have a series of events up till Saturday. Feel free to check them out. We have flyers available over there, so you can grab them before you leave. And in particular, I want to take a minute and invite everyone to the Interfaith Dinner, which is happening this Thursday in Trabant. You can pick up your tickets in the box offices of Trabant and the Bob Carpenter Center. Only $10. It's open to everyone. You can invite people from your group, your friends, your family, so be sure to check that out as well. And for more information about that, you can speak to us about it at the conclusion of the event, or you can look it up on our Facebook page, MSA Delaware. All right, so tonight we are so lucky to have Miss Suzy Ismail with us. She is currently a visiting professor at DeVry University in North Brunswick, New Jersey, and she's also the curriculum developer and lead instructor at the Center of Muslim Life, which is a non-profit social platform that focuses on strengthening marriage, family, and community life. She received her bachelor's in English, Communication, and Middle Eastern Studies. She also received her master's in Communication and Information Studies and attended the School of Communication at Rutgers University as a doctoral student in the field of intercultural and organizational communication. She specializes in presenting a range of communication seminars and workshops at major corporations, conferences, and events that address issues such as marriage, divorce, unity, youth and women empowerment, and cultural and religious diversity in the workplace. Since 1999, she has been speaking, teaching, and writing professionally on a national and international level. Ms. Ismail is the Vice President of her children's school board of directors and serves on several other nonprofit boards and commissions as well. So tonight she'll be speaking to us on the topic of women in Islam, including their rights and their roles, and she will also touch upon the topic of hijab, the headscarf. And actually earlier today we had a booth set up in Trabant, and girls had the opportunity to try on the scarf. It was really interesting. We have that set up here as well, so maybe if there's time, you can check that out. So without further ado, join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Suzy Ismail.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام.
For those of you who are not familiar, anytime a Muslim begins a speech or giving a talk, the precedent prior to speaking is usually a small prayer similar to what it is that I just began with, asking God to help loosen the tongue, open the heart, and allow the words that come from the mouth to be truthful words. So I pray that in this gathering, that's what we'll share tonight among each other. And one thing that you've probably picked up throughout Islamic Awareness Week, and if you have friends who are Muslims, if you've interacted with Muslims, is that as Muslims, Islam itself is a very integral part of each Muslim individual's life. So rather than living life, 6 days a week and then practicing Islam only on Sundays or only on Fridays, Islam itself is an integral way of life. And it affects everything that a Muslim does, from the way that a Muslim speaks, to the way that a Muslim writes, the way a Muslim talks, the way a Muslim interacts. and the way a Muslim dresses. And so the focus of tonight's talk is about women in Islam, but primarily about the hijab and its role in Islam and the way that many Muslim women dress in wearing the hijab. So to start off, whenever we talk about women in Islam, whenever I'm invited to speak about women in Islam, whether it's for a Muslim audience or a non-Muslim audience, 9 times out of 10, the title of the lecture will always be something like Beyond the Veil, Women in Islam, or Behind the Veil, Women in Islam, Uncovering Women in Islam. And there is this fascination and slight obsession with the concept of covering in Islam. And although it is an integral part of the religion and often a very identifiable form of relating an individual to a religion, it's not all-encompassing. There is more to the religion, there is more to being a Muslim man or a Muslim woman than the hijab. But the reason why the hijab, or the traditional dress, the covering that a woman wears, has drawn so much attention is because the function of the hijab, which is a form of outward modesty, is such an integral part of the religion itself. It is said that every religion has one defining characteristic, and that in the religion of Islam, the defining characteristic is that of haya, or modesty. And it is because that is the defining characteristic of the religion, because it is seen in the interactions and the actions of all who practice the religion, it becomes so tied and associated with people in people's minds when they think of Islam, when they think of the religion, and primarily when they think of Muslim women. So what we want to do today is really talk about why it's so important, why it's integral, why many women wear the hijab, why some women do not wear the hijab, the different variations of the hijab as well, and really just get a better understanding of what the hijab is. First and foremost, we can't deny that we live in a world today where there is an obsession with women's bodies. There is an obsession with beauty as related to women. And we define beauty in our society today, in the West primarily, as being equated with a woman's body or a woman's physical appearance. Now, I always find it very interesting that this is not the case everywhere in the world. This may be our narrative as individuals living in the West, but you can go to other places in the world and find that the concept of beauty is so different than the way that we have chosen to define beauty, the way that we have made beauty synonymous with a woman's body, a woman's hair, a woman's outward appearance. And one example that I often use when I'm teaching my classes is that if you've ever traveled or if you've ever read about a tribe called the Wadobi tribe in Papua New Guinea, they're a tribe who is considered one of the last untouched tribes in our society. Recently they have been touched, they made a movie about the Wadobi tribe, so I doubt that they're still untouched. But for a very, very long time, they were considered the untouched civilization. Now in the Wadobi tribe, interestingly enough, beauty is not equated with women. Women are seen as very functional members of society, but men are seen as beautiful. So the men in the Wadobi tribe will often shave part of their forelock and will draw a line, a white line, from the back of where they've shaved all the way down to the tip of their nose. And when asked why they would do that, the response is that a man's nose, if it's longer, it's more beautiful. So the longer the nose, the more beautiful the man's face. And to us that might sound really strange, like why would a long nose be equated with beauty? But let's think of how we perceive women's bodies. And sometimes we think certain things when they're larger are more attractive. So interestingly enough, based on what society decides to define as most attractive, the gender that is assigned the role of being beautiful often strives to meet those expectations. So with the Wadobi tribe, the men in that tribe also feel that white teeth are very attractive. Now that's something similar that we see in our culture as well, right? Because whenever you see any billboard or you flip through any magazine, Cosmopolitan or Vogue, the first thing we see is those pearly whites, right? We see a woman with a great smile and very white teeth. But because the Wadobi tribe has not had access to toothpaste, in order to make their teeth look whiter, they dye their lips black. So a long white line reaching down the nose, black lips, and the final element of beauty in defining the manhood or defining the beauty of a man in the Wadobi tribe are very red eyes and a man who can hold his eye in a cross-eyed pose the longest. And again, if we try to hold our eyes cross-eyed, I don't think many of us would succeed for a long time. But in the Wadobi tribe, this is what is defined as beautiful. Again, for us as outsiders looking in at this culture, we might feel like this is ridiculous. How could somebody who's cross-eyed be considered beautiful? But if we just take a look at Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or Pinterest or whatever's happening these days online, and we see so many of the selfies these days, and many young women are posing with the duck face. And it's like, how long can you hold the duck face for, And again, we may see cross-eyedness as not beautiful, but instead we define our beauty in a different way. So why do we do this? Let's see, let's try to understand it together. I want you all to raise your left hand. I'm going to make you take a vow. No, I'm kidding. Now raise your right hand. Okay. Now put your right hand on your head. Now put your right hand on your shoulder. Now put your right hand on your knee. Now put your right hand again on your head. Now put your right hand on your chin. All right. How many of you actually put your right hand on your chin? And the people in the front can't see you, but I saw you. How many of you put your hand on your ear? Okay. Why, those of you who put your hand on your ear, why did you do that?
I was following you.
You were following me, yes. Because my visual was more powerful than my verbal. Because we as humans tend to view first and judge with our eyes before we judge with our ears. And if we had more time, we would have played Simon Says for a lot longer, and I'm sure I could have tripped more of you up. But we have been trained by society to focus on what we see, to visually assess what's in front of us. So there's no way of going around the fact that we as humans look. We look at each other, we look at our surrounding world, we look at many things, and we judge based on what we see. And this is the way God has created us. So it doesn't mean that we should walk with our eyes closed and not accept the fact that we can see, not appreciate our sight, not understand what it is that we see. But what it does mean is that we have to focus on what we see and separate our judgments, base it on more than just what we see, particularly when it comes to viewing either gender, a male or a female. We live in a society today where the objectification of women is rampant. We can't deny it. We see it in advertisement, we see it in movies, we hear it in songs when Eminem and Akon are telling us smack that, knowing what that is. We hear it from Katy Perry, who's calling herself a dark horse, and Miley Cyrus, who sees herself as a wrecking ball. We see objectification everywhere. And the danger of objectification is that sometimes it escapes from the media and it seeps into our own narratives, so that we as women will begin to act upon those narratives of objectification that society is feeding us. So when a popular woman like Beyonce or Kim Kardashian or whoever seems to be in the view of the media decides to display herself and allow the world to focus on her external body parts, on what the shape of her body, on the way she sachets her hips, she's buying into that narrative that society has kind of given us. And for many of us growing up here, we probably grew up with many different stories, that told us about what it means to look on the inside, to not judge a book by its cover, to focus on the internal and not the external. One of my favorite stories related to this topic is the story of the emperor's new clothes. And for those of you who are not familiar with it or who need a refresher, in that story, there were two con men who decided they wanted to go to the emperor and sell him some new clothes. But they weren't tailors, they had no cloth, they couldn't really make clothes. But they came up with the greatest con in the history of the clothing industry. And what they came up with was an invisible thread. And they went to this very vain emperor who had bought into the idea that he always had to have the finest clothes, that he always had to look the best of everyone in the kingdom. And they told him that they had a fabric that was better than any fabric anyone else has had. And they said that their fabric could only be seen by those who were wise. And if you were a fool, you could not see the fabric. And so they sat for hours and hours pretending to sew this invisible cloth. And they would call the emperor over and he would look at the invisible cloth and they would say, you know, do you see it? Isn't it beautiful? And of course, not wanting to look like a fool, he bought into it and he'd say, oh, it's lovely, it's beautiful, it drapes so nicely. And so there came a day when the emperor was going to parade himself in front of the kingdom and he was to wear his new clothes. And so he undressed and, you know, he had just his undergarments on. And the two con men did quite a show of putting on the invisible clothes and commenting and telling him how beautiful he looked. And the emperor paraded through the land. And although everybody knew that all he was wearing was his undergarments, nobody wanted to look like the fool. So they all complimented and said, oh, what lovely clothes, how nice you look. And regardless of the fact that the emperor must have felt a breeze in very unseemly areas, regardless of the fact that when he looked in the mirror, there really was nothing there. He was afraid to be called a fool. And so he instead acted just like a fool. And it wasn't except for one young child who was still innocent and who could call them as they come, kind of a thing, who called out to him in the parade and said, you're not wearing any clothes. And it was such a revelation, because suddenly the emperor realized that he'd been had. That these con men had told him if he wore the invisible clothes, he'd look amazing, he'd look great, he'd look hot, he'd be, you know, all that in a bag of chips. And you know what? He was practically naked. In some narrations, he's completely naked, but we'll just go with the practically naked, you know? So he had nothing on. And today, for many of us, this is the lie that we've been fed as women. This is what society has ingrained in our minds as well, and for men it goes as well. Where we've been told by the clothing industry, by Hollywood, by the music that we listen to stop self-respecting, to focus on the outside, to drape ourselves in invisible, worthless clothes, because that's what's important. Because everybody should look at you. And our selfies that we take all the time and post on Facebook, our pictures, you know, there was a big to-do about Ellen's Academy Award selfie, right? Everybody posing with a duck face, everybody trying to get into the picture. This is what we've been told is important. And this is what society keeps pulling us toward. Because if we are occupied with this individualistic view, we lose more and more the connection to the collectivistic view. We lose more and more that concept of caring for those around us, and we focus instead only about me, me, me. We look out for number one, and we decide that we're number one. And in that selfish society, in that society that's fueled by people who only care about themselves, we make way for unspeakable ills to happen. We make way for things to be going on that we don't even focus on anymore because we've decided that it's all about us and it's all about the external. But unfortunately, it's not just society, the clothing industry, media that we can point fingers at. Sometimes it's easy to do that, to say, oh, it's the songs, it's the movies, it's the books, that's what's causing this. But again, we internalize these definitions sometimes, and sometimes we subvert the definitions and we change them completely. I'm going to go back to our talk about the hijab. So the hijab for a Muslim woman is the covering of her body, of everything except for the hands and the face. We'll see in some countries where women will also wear something called the niqab, which is a complete covering that also includes covering of the face. We see the burqa, which is also a covering that sometimes has a little mesh on top of the eyes. So we have different variations. There's the khimar, which covers the chest, but still allows the hands and the face to show. So we see different variations of the hijab, and we're going to talk in more detail about the definition from the Quran, from the Holy Book, on what the definition of hijab is. But first off, whenever you go to a lecture given by a Muslim scholar, and many times in our communities, in our society, the most eminent scholars, the preeminent scholars, are male scholars. And many times they will talk about the topic of hijab because it is an integral part of our religion, of our society, of who we are as individuals. But many times in trying to explain the hijab, many of these scholars and these lecturers will try to come up with analogies, and they're very human analogies. So I'm sure many of the Muslims here, if you've ever attended a lecture, you've heard the comparison of the Muslim woman to a pearl. You know, the Muslim woman is like a pearl, and we have to keep the pearl because it's so treasured in an oyster, and the oyster has to be hidden on the bottom of the ocean underneath the sand. And this is why our Muslim women cover. Or we've heard, you know, the flower analogy. The Muslim woman is like a flower. She blossoms, but she can only blossom for her husband. And if she doesn't wear the hijab, then she's going to wither and she's going to die. Or we've heard this is a more recent one that I've seen circulating in the networks. The comparison of the Muslim woman to a lollipop or a piece of candy. And the idea is that, you know, if you take a piece of candy that's covered and a piece of candy that's uncovered, and you throw them both on the floor and you pick them up, which one is the child going to choose? The uncovered or the covered? The covered one, because the uncovered one would be all dirty and have bugs and things around it. And this is why Muslim women cover. And I find it fascinating that we try to understand hijab, we try to understand a commandment from God using these human analogies that really don't do justice or justification to the reason why a Muslim woman wears hijab. Personally, I wear hijab. I am not a pearl, I am not a flower, and I'm definitely not a candy or a lollipop. Right? That's not what God has defined me as. That's not why I wear hijab. And you know, interestingly, in kind of an aftermath of the candy concept, somebody came up with the idea of a kiwi to explain why Muslim men have beards. And the idea was that if you have a kiwi that's uncut, then you know it's protected. But if you cut open a kiwi or you peel off the skin of the kiwi, that hairy skin, then it's unprotected. And if you throw them both on the floor, which would you prefer? The hairy kiwi or the not hairy kiwi? And as ridiculous, I'm hoping you're all shaking your heads and saying that's a horrible analogy. It really is. But just as ridiculous as the kiwi analogy is, so is the candy analogy, so is the pearl analogy. And it's not okay to use these objectifications because they're just as bad as the objectifications that the media is throwing at us. To say that a Muslim woman covers because she has to be hidden is not what God has commanded. When we look at the Quran and we look at how God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, describes men and women, there's an ayah in Surah Al-Ahzab, a verse in the Quran, that talks about men and women, and it says, indeed the Muslim men and the Muslim women, the believing men and the believing women, the obedient men and the obedient women, the truthful men and the truthful women, the patient men and the patient women, the humble men and the humble women, the charitable men and the charitable women, the fasting men and the fasting women, the men who guard their chastity and the women who do so, and the men who remember Allah often and the women who do so. For them Allah has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. In this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God, is telling us that man or woman, you will be judged on the merit of your deeds. Man or woman, you must believe. Man or woman, you must be obedient. Man or woman, you must be truthful. Man or woman, you must be humble, and so on and so forth. And so in the eyes of God, this is the utmost equality, knowing that it doesn't matter what gender I am. It doesn't matter how I look externally. It doesn't matter what my physical appearance is. That physical creation, I will be judged on my actions and whether or not I am obedient to God. And to return to what we talked about earlier, that Islam truly is a way of life. In Surah An-Nur, which is another part of the Quran, another chapter of the Quran, there is a commandment about modesty. And the ayahs of Surah An-Nur, which are those that are often used to explain hijab or to understand what is hijab for a Muslim woman and a Muslim man. So in the ayahs of Surah An-Nur, the interesting thing is that the first verse, verse 30, the first verse that talks about modesty, is a commandment to believing men to be modest. The verse begins and says, tell the believing men to be modest and to lower their gaze and to guard their chastity. And then the verse that follows, which is verse 31, says, and tell the believing women to be modest and to lower their gaze and guard their chastity and to cover, and it lists the khimar, to draw their covering around themselves, okay, and to cover the chest And it goes on to explain from who the covering, who would be covered, who a Muslim woman should be covered in front of, which is essentially those men who she is not related to. So those who are not marriageable for her. So a Muslim woman, of course, does not cover in front of her brother, she does not cover in front of her father, she does not cover in front of her husband, she does not cover in front of her uncle. It is those who are marriageable is who she covers in front of. So let's try to understand where from this verse in the Quran we understood how a Muslim woman should dress, or why a Muslim woman should dress in this way. In order to understand this verse and to understand what it means to draw the covering around the chest, the khimar is the word that's used, we have to look at the historical perspective. So in the Jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic days, women traditionally always covered. Women of honor always covered. So any woman who had high status, any woman who was considered respectable, always drew a head covering over her hair when she went out, but often the head covering was left open, so the chest was left bare. Right? And sometimes the dress that the woman would wear might be a little see-through, but the hair was always covered. There was always that khimar already drawn upon the head. So when the injunction in the Quran came to draw the head covering around the chest, this was covered. What needed to be covered was the chest, and so the khimar needed to be pulled here to cover the chest as well. If we look at pictures, again, women of the pre-Islamic era, and it's interesting because as I was driving here from New Jersey even, it was, I think I was just pulling into Delaware right after the tolls. There's a very large church on that corner. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but in front of that church, if anyone knows what I'm talking about, what is there a statue of? What is it? There's a silver lady. Yes, who is that silver lady? Who is it? Who is it? Okay, the silver lady in Islam, we would say that was Maryam. Maryam radiallahu anha. In the Christian faith, that would be called the Virgin Mary. Okay? And that's who that statue represents. But what is that statue wearing on her head? A scarf. And in any picture that we see of women, even in the pre-Islamic day, women of honor, women of respect, women who had status in society, there was always that scarf covering the hair. The only women who did not cover were those who were considered of lower class, not equal to the women of honor. And those women, and there are many narrations about slave women prior to Islam, who if they exited the home with a scarf thrown over their head, they were beaten, because it was considered a level of respect afforded only to those women who deserved respect. So with the advent of Islam, with the concept of hijab of all believing women, that all believing women should draw their khimar around their chest, there was an equalization. There was an understanding that all women deserved this honor of covering themselves, an understanding that all women had the right to cover themselves and should cover themselves as obedience to God, as obedience to the commandment of God. If we move even to our more recent American history, I don't know if any of you used to watch the show Little House on the Prairie, kind of giving my age away. I'm so glad you know the show I'm talking about. Look it up. I don't know if it's on YouTube or not, but look up Little House on the Prairie. So it was my favorite show when I was growing up. And it documented life in like the 1800s, late 1800s, even the early 1900s. And in that show there was some characters, popular characters who were sisters. And one of the sisters, Laura Ingalls, went out of the home one time and in one episode without wearing her bonnet. And it was such a scandal. Laura left the home without her bonnet. And it was like the end of the world that she left the home without the bonnet. Why? Because it was a symbol of honor and respect for a woman to exit the home with that covering. And we're talking about the late 1800s up until the 1900s. It wasn't until the 1920s, when the sudden advent of the feminist movement, the Roaring 20s, was born, that women began to feel that if they removed their clothing, if they removed their head covering, if they stopped wearing hats and bonnets and shortened their dresses, they would be perceived as equals in the work world. They could compete with men. They could have that same role. But in that process, what we see today is there is this pull and tug about the definition of what it means to be a woman. How is a woman defined? And if you look again, if we're going back a few years back in history, in 1958, a woman by the name of Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And this book caused a lot of waves because in it she asked the central question of what does it mean to be a woman? How can we define the role of a woman? How should a woman dress? How should she act? How should she talk? How do we define a woman? Now you would think this book that came out in 1958, we're now in 2014, so several decades later, you would think that we would have answered this question. But we haven't. In 2013, a book came out by a very popular figure in today's business world, Sheryl Sandberg. You're familiar with the name? She's currently the CEO of Facebook. And the book that she wrote is called Lean In. And she wrote it in response to a situation that occurred at a graduation speech she was giving. She was giving a speech at Barnard College, which is an all-women's college, and many successful women graduate from there. And in her graduation speech, she told the women, you know, you think that the most important thing for you to decide right now is what career path you're going to follow or what job offer you're going to take. But I'm here to tell you the most important decision you're going to make in your life is who you marry. Now, she said this, and you can imagine, you know, the outpouring of apples that were thrown at her and eggs, and, you know, there was mad hysteria in the audience. The women were very upset by this statement. You know, how can we regress back to the time of you telling us it's all about who you marry? I'm never going to get married. Why should I have to depend on a man? And so she wrote this book, Lean In, as a response to this outpouring. And in it she tried to explain what she meant. But she kept going back to that central question. What does it mean to be a woman today? How do you define womanhood? How should a woman act? How can a woman be successful in the home and also be successful in the work world or in the outside world? And you know what? At the end of the book, she still couldn't answer the question. We still couldn't answer the question because we've come to a point in our lives where there is so much push and pull where we don't know how to negotiate our roles anymore as women. We don't know what we're expected to do and what we're not expected to do. You know, I see this even in our Muslim communities many times. Young Muslim girls are raised in families and they're told, be the best you can in school. You know, if they get an A- on a test, the question from the parents is, why didn't you get the A+? You know, who else got 100? You know? And so we're raised being told education is important, educate yourself, go to college, get a master's, get a PhD even, but also get married. And once you're married, have the cleanest home possible. Cook the best biryani out there. You know, make sure you know how to make whatever it is from scratch. Raise your children and make sure they're the best children ever. And so many of our women in our societies today are being pulled in so many directions because the reality is that as women we can't do it all. No individual can do it all and we can't do it all alone. And so it's important that we remember to go back to the simplicity, the simple concept. The fact that first and foremost, for me, the way that I define myself is as a Muslim woman. For me, what that means is that my purpose on this earth is to worship God, to worship He who created me. And in worshiping God, I will follow and obey the commandments of God. So when the commandments of God tells me to cover, because that is a badge of my faith, one of the side benefits is it's an external expression of modesty. Another side benefit is that when I speak to someone, I know that it's my voice that's being heard and not my booty that's being checked out. It's another benefit that I know that I can maintain that hayat, that concept of modesty, and still interact in the workplace. So these are side benefits, but first and foremost, my purpose is to worship God. And in doing that, I follow the commandments of God. And this is not to say that men don't have any concept of hijab. Again, if we return to Surah An-Nur, that chapter that I spoke about in the Quran, the first ayah about modesty is a commandment to men to be modest. So men are required to act with modesty, men are required to lower their gaze, men are required to cover their awra, or what's considered their private parts or attractive parts, okay, which is from the navel to the knee. And men are required to act in a way that is befitting of a Muslim man, of that concept of haya, integrating that modesty in all they do. Now, does that always happen? No. And the issue that we see in society today is that the religion of Islam is so often judged by the Muslims who practice it. People will equate the actions of government rulers in many Middle Eastern countries, for instance, who are corrupt and doing things that are completely against the religion, and will point and say, look, that's Islam. People will equate the fact that there is oppression against women in many Muslim countries and say, this is Islam. But it's not. Unfortunately, what we see happening today is that those who are in power are also those who are controlling the education. And the inflow of education is being filtered through mediums of individuals who want to control society. You know, if you're familiar with Greg Mortensen, he was a mountain climber who had been climbing mountains in Pakistan and Afghanistan when he had gotten lost and he got hurt while he was there many years ago. And so a family in Afghanistan took him in a small village and they nursed him back to health, and he wrote a book called 3 Cups of Tea. And they gave him 3 cups of tea to drink because in that they said to him, once you drink 3 cups of tea with the family, then you are like family to us. And he was so grateful. He promised this family that if he ever made it out, if he ever was able to regain his health and his strength, he would start a foundation and he would help build schools in that village and in neighboring villages. And so he was true to his word, and Greg Mortensen, when he came back to the United States, he created a great foundation to build schools. But the interesting thing is that all of the schools that he built in Afghanistan and Pakistan were schools for girls only. And so the media began to ask him, why are you only building schools for girls? Don't you think it's important to educate boys? And so he responded and he said, if I educate a boy, I've educated one individual. If I educate a girl, I've educated generations to come. And this is what we are seeing today. That power of womanhood, that understanding that across the globe, women are often the ones who will carry on the legacy of education. Women are often the ones who will pass on knowledge from generation to generation. And so these are the same women that governments are controlling. These are the same women that are being denied education so that they will not know, they will not be exposed to what it means to be a Muslim woman in Islam, what it means to have the rights of a Muslim woman in Islam.